Good morning everyone. Today we'll be talking about a whole new topic entirely since we are beginning a new month. We'll be talking about a study of the Indian diaspora, and today we'll be talking about the basic preliminaries when analyzing it essentially. So the Indian diaspora essentially consists of either non-resident Indians or OCIs, which are overseas citizens of India, who essentially have been inhabiting other countries which are also called host countries, far away from their home countries. So it could be just first generation migrants, it could also be migrants that have stayed in their host countries for many generations and now there are third or fourth generations living there. Now the Indian diaspora is one of the largest in the world, and reports have found that about 2.5 million individuals immigrate every year, and their population abroad is in the millions, in the high millions. And indeed the Indian diaspora are a very heterogeneous group in that they are distributed amongst different classes, different castes, and indeed they are also somewhere where they are majorities, like in Mauritius or Fiji. In other places they are minorities. In some places they have remained for decades, in some places they are relatively new arrivals. So the heterogeneity of the Indian diaspora is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to frame a uniform diasporic policy. And the Indian government has been trying since independence to frame a diasporic policy of some kind that is comprehensive and that will apply to all the diaspora. But because the diaspora is so heterogeneous and because each of the diaspora has different demands, has different aspirations, has different needs, it has always proven difficult for the Indian government to frame a uniform policy for them. Of course, our approach to the diaspora has significantly been altered over the years. After we became independent, the Nehruvian idea of self-reliance and non-alignment also translated into keeping a sort of active dissociation from the diaspora that was living abroad at that time. And this is not surprising because political leaders at that time were trying to make a new nation with complete sovereignty, with complete independence, and perhaps associating with those who had loyalties in other countries did not align with that. Of course, that did not last, even though the Nehruvian idea of dissociation did last, but then we were in a terrible balance of payments crisis in the 1970s, and we were essentially saved out of that by the remittances from the diaspora themselves. However, the Nehruvian policy of dissociation continued well into the 1990s until, of course, the triple waves of liberalization, globalization and privatization and the opening up of the Indian economy under the Narasimha Rao, and then, of course, under the Bihari Vajpayee government and then the Manmohan Singh government, that essentially led to the formation of a lot of new policies in dealing with the diaspora, which is why, for example, 9th January is Pravasi Bharatiya Divas. There was the establishment of a Department of Overseas Affairs and a lot of other things of this sort, where the Indian government understood the value of the diaspora and began to constructively engage with them. However, perhaps no government or no prime minister singularly has engaged or intensified diasporic engagement as much as Prime Minister Modi. I think he has understood the fact that if you harness the wealth and the economic prowess as well as the capabilities, the resources and the loyalties of the massively wealthy, massively well-placed and extremely numerous Indian diaspora, it could be used to essentially increase India's growth potential. It could be used to attract investments in trade, in industrial development and in tourism. And also I think the Modi government understood that it could also be used to benefit the party as well. So because of this reason, the social media PM, as Modi has been dubbed by the BBC, has really utilized the digital media landscape to engage with the diaspora like never before. His thousands of events that he has carefully curated abroad, like the Howdy Modi event in 2019 or his 2015 event to the UAE, where he visited the working class diaspora to essentially prove that his policy of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas essentially also entailed him getting to know and engaging fully with not only wealthy diaspora but also diaspora in the Gulf state who were not as wealthy. And indeed, it is absolutely true that Modi's policies have worked in his favor. There has been much higher diasporic engagement in India, although of course it remains to be seen what will be the long-term effects of it. Now, the diaspora are important for a variety of reasons, but they are essentially important for mainly two reasons. Number one is that they actively influence the foreign policies of the countries of which they are a part right now, the host countries, because they hold very important positions in their political systems or in their legal systems or in their judicial systems. So using that strength, or even in the media, so they use that strength to essentially successfully lobby the host government to essentially form policies that will be for the better benefit of India, whether culturally speaking, educationally speaking, or even in hard politics, whether it be diplomatically speaking or economically speaking. This is their active involvement. But their sheer numerical strength also allows them to inactively or indirectly lobby for changes or alterations to existing policies of their host countries for the benefit of their home countries as well. So for this reason and for many other reasons, the diaspora, the Indian diaspora, they act as key facilitators, as key bridges, as key and essentially key to the relationship between their home country and their host country. And because diasporic connections are generally formed on kinship or familial lines, these interrelations essentially only grow deeper with age. So what the diaspora essentially function as is that they are bridges. They act as bridges tying up whatever discourses are happening in their host country with whatever discourses are happening in their home country. And especially because now under the Modi government, diasporas have been called India's permanent ambassadors. Essentially what they also do, or what the Modi government hopes that they would do, is that they would represent the interests of their home country abroad. Now, one of the Modi government's biggest successes when dealing with the diaspora is that he has completely also reversed the brain drain debate. In that, before the Modi government came into power, especially in the early 2000s, there was a debate that there was a phenomenon of brain drain happening where all the highly educated Indians were all moving abroad in search of better opportunities. He has reversed his insular debate to essentially present India as a repository and the original supplier of the talent in the world. And he has essentially done this to ensure that the host countries are aware of the value, the strategic value that the Indian diaspora presents to them, and so that he may be able to leverage them for the India's benefit essentially. Now when we look at the diaspora, essentially the diaspora have migrated in 4 key migration currents. Now these are all interweaving currents, and they are not completely as clear cut and dry as perhaps it will come out to be. So whenever I am talking about these 4 key migration currents, it is important to remember that these are all interweaving and these are extremely dynamic. So the first migration current was that of the trade diaspora, because there were Indus Valley seals found in Central Asia, in Samarkand, in the old Ottoman Empire. It is obvious that in the early 1200s, Indian traders, especially the various individuals from North India at that time, the Multanis for example, they all immigrated or they left their country in search for better trade prospects all around Central Asia. And now what we have to remember about the trade diaspora is, like, unlike the other waves of diasporic immigration, this was neither permanent nor coerced. All of this was generally voluntary movement. And it was not meant to be permanent. Essentially, perhaps maybe fathers would settle down in one region and their sons would explore other regions and essentially form an environment in which other members of the family can join them. So there were trade diasporas originating from India from the early 1200s and perhaps even before that. And there have been sources that have consistently proven that even in Australia, even in Europe, there have been consistent presence of the Indian trade diaspora from the early 1200s. In fact, Indus Valley seals have been found in the early BMAC civilization as well. This is the first wave of the diaspora. The second wave of the diaspora essentially came in the colonial times, where with the abolition of slavery in the 1800s, there was suddenly a lack or a paucity of workers in the cash crop plantations that the British had elsewhere. Indians were essentially transferred to their colonies in the Caribbean or in the South Pacific or in East Africa to work as indentured laborers in these cash crop plantations, to essentially replace the vacuum that had been left when slaves were essentially illegalized. So these indentured laborers were definitely coerced to go, and they did not have any intention of staying there forever. However, as we know, especially in Fiji, Guyana, Mauritius, Trinidad and Tobago, the Indian diaspora has been there for centuries now essentially, and they have a definitely dominant population. So there have been generations of Indians who began with indentured laborers who have settled there. Now, the third current of migration essentially involves three interweaving currents essentially, and these are all equally contentious in their own ways. Now, the first current, the first sub current under this is during the partition, where several Hindus from East and West Pakistan migrated to India and Muslims from India migrated to East and West Pakistan, fearing subordination or domination by the religious majority in the place that they were leaving. Of course, we understand that the partition was a long history of dispossession and terror and a lot of violence. This is the first kind of diaspora, and of course, their various waves of migration have been recorded differently in the various citizenship acts, which of course still continue to cause problems today. The second subcurrent under this was also highly educated Indians, whether they be doctors or entrepreneurs or business professionals, who essentially left India in the 1960s to move to the US or UK because they were frustrated with the socialist policies that India was following at that time, and they felt that there weren't enough opportunities for them within the country. So this is the second wave of diaspora, were the highly skilled diaspora who essentially left mostly for the global north. Now, the third wave of diaspora are those who essentially from Bihar or from UP or from Kerala, who then migrated as middle class or lower class laborers to work in the petroleum sector in the Gulf states. Currently, their working conditions, their conditions of pay, their low standards of life in the Gulf states, the treatment that they receive at that point is one of the main focuses for the India's diaspora policy for the Middle East. And in fact, there have been demands from that side of the population for the Indian government to make their issues an important part of the broad diaspora policy as well. Now, the fourth current of migration are also called twice diasporas. These are individuals who left their first host country to move into a second host country. So this could, for example, be individuals who left for the Netherlands, for example, from Fiji, or individuals who left from Suriname for the Netherlands as well, which was essentially a Dutch colony. It could also be individuals who left during Idi Amin's regime in East Africa and fled to the UK or to the US. And it is interesting to note here that these diasporas did, of course, cultivate stirrings of their homeland. However, they chose not to return home and instead cultivated better economic or socio-cultural links elsewhere. So essentially, the value of the diaspora cannot be ignored. Indeed, they have been contributing significantly to India. If when we were only following a remittance-based approach, they saved us on our balance of payment crisis. Now they form important tools in soft power diplomacy, even in hard power diplomacy, where, for example, they helped in the negotiating of the US civil nuclear deal. During the Atal Bihari Vajpayee regime, they also helped in justifying India's Kargil war and nuclear blasts as well. So all in all, the diasporas play a very important role. Of course, their heterogeneity is a concern for the Indian government because they are unable to form a uniform policy for them. This has moved miles ahead under the Modi government's regime. And one would hope that if the Indian government is able to constructively engage better with the Indian diaspora, it will only reap huge economic and social and political benefits for India.